Like, the highway at night is a strange, liminal space. It's a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the dark, connecting the islands of civilization we built to keep the wilderness at bay. When you're driving in the dead of night, enveloped by the hum of the engine and the hypnotic rhythm of the center lines, it's easy to feel invisible, untouchable. But out there in the sprawling emptiness, between the glowing signs of gas stations and the desolate rest stops, the rules change. Isolation breeds opportunity. And sometimes, the headlights in your rearview mirror aren't just a fellow traveler passing through. Sometimes, they are hunting you. Tonight, we have 3 stories of nocturnal survival. 3 terrifying encounters from the lonely American roads. Check your mirrors. Lock your doors, and listen closely. Story 1. The Quick Check Encounter. If you live in a sprawling, rural town, you understand the geography of isolation. The distances between necessities are vast. For our first narrator, the only beacon of 24/7 civilization was a quick check convenience store, sitting solitary off a quiet local highway, a solid 25-minute drive from his home. He was a night owl, a programmer whose productivity peaked in the dead hours between 0 p.m. and 0 a.m. His sleep schedule was atrocious, but he was comfortable with it. He was a regular at this particular quick check, a nondescript guy blending into the fluorescent hum of the graveyard shift. It was past midnight last week. He was deep in the flow state, hammering out code on his laptop, when the inevitable late-night hunger struck. He shut his laptop, grabbed his keys, and made the drive. The local highway was a ghost town, an empty strip of blacktop cutting through the rural dark. He pulled into the starkly lit parking lot, ordered a sandwich from the deli counter, and began to pace. Fueled by caffeine and a touch of ADHD, he couldn't stand still while waiting. He wandered the aisles, letting his mind wander. As he turned down the back aisle, his eyes swept over the glowing row of refrigerated drink cases. And he stopped dead. Sitting on the linoleum floor, directly facing one of the glass refrigerator doors, was a man. He wasn't kneeling to grab a soda. He was sitting fully cross-legged, perfectly still, staring intensely into the brightly lit case. The narrator blinked, assuming his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. He looked away, then snapped his head back. The man was still there. He was draped in a heavy brown coat and faded jeans, an absurd outfit considering the store's heating was cranked up. The bizarre posture sparked a morbid curiosity. The narrator wanted to see the man's face. He formulated a clumsy plan, walked down an adjacent aisle, quickly round the corner, catch a glimpse of the stranger's profile, and retreat before being noticed. He moved silently down the neighboring aisle. He reached the end cap. He leaned his head around the corner. He didn't get a look at the man's profile, because the moment the narrator peeked around the shelf, the man's head violently whipped around. They locked eyes. The narrator froze, caught completely off guard by the aggressive, unnatural speed of the movement. The face staring back at him was the stuff of nightmares. The man was clearly, dangerously under the influence of something potent. His eyes were blown wide, completely unblinking, the white stark against his pale skin. But it was his mouth that made the narrator's stomach turn. The man's lower lip was vibrating rapidly, a violent, uncontrolled quiver, as if he were freezing to death. His body posture, which had looked relaxed from behind, was actually a knot of rigid, straining muscles. But the most terrifying aspect was the expression. It wasn't anger. It wasn't confusion. It was an absolute, cavernous emptiness. A dead-eyed stare that stripped away any trace of humanity. He looked like a corpse that had been suddenly, violently reanimated. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The heavy, suffocating silence of the convenience store amplified the tension. Finally, the narrator's self-preservation instinct broke the paralysis. He violently broke eye contact, turned on his heel, and fast-walked back toward the deli counter. His heart hammered against his ribs. He positioned himself so he could watch the end of the aisle, half expecting the shivering man in the brown coat to crawl around the corner. But the aisles remained empty. When his order was finally called, he snatched the bag, practically ran to his car, and threw it into gear, desperate to leave the surreal horror of the store behind. As he swung his sedan toward the highway exit, a sudden burst of movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. He glanced back at the brightly lit storefront. Bursting through the double glass doors, moving with a frantic, explosive speed, was the man in the brown coat. He was dead sprinting across the pavement toward the far, darkened edge of the parking lot. As the narrator accelerated onto the highway, he caught a final glimpse of the man violently throwing himself into the driver's seat of a pickup truck. Wait, what the hell is that guy rushing to do it to? Like, Zaro M. The narrator thought, suppressing a shudder. He hit the gas, grateful to be putting miles between himself and the unhinged stranger. He settled into the drive. The glowing quick check sign vanished in his rearview mirror, replaced by the suffocating darkness of the rural highway. He was the only car on the road. The silence of the night crept back in. 5 minutes later, a pair of headlights materialized in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought nothing of it. But the headlights were growing larger. They were closing the distance fast. Much faster than the speed limit. Assuming it was a local sheriff running a speed trap, the narrator instinctively eased off the accelerator, bracing himself for the flashing red and blues. The vehicle rapidly closed the gap, pulling dangerously close to his rear bumper. The headlights flooded the cab of his sedan. It wasn't a police cruiser. It was a pickup truck. The narrator's blood ran cold. The profile of the grille, the height of the headlights. It was the exact same truck from the far end of the quick check parking lot. Panic ignited. He slammed his foot on the gas, pushing the sedan up to 80 miles an hour. The truck instantly matched his speed. The driver began flashing his high beams aggressively, laying on the horn, the blaring sound cutting through the quiet night. A terrifying calculus ran through the narrator's mind. Do I pull over and pray he passes? Or do I run? He was in a lightweight sedan. The pursuer was in a heavy truck. If he stopped on this desolate stretch of road, he was completely at the mercy of a man who looked like a reanimated corpse. He chose to run. He buried the accelerator. The speedometer needle climbed. 100 miles an hour. The truck stayed glued to his bumper, a relentless, roaring shadow in the dark. The terror transcended panic. It became a cold, absolute certainty of impending death. At 100 miles an hour, a single mistake meant a fatal rollover. He swerved violently into the right lane, hoping the truck would blow past him. The truck violently swerved with him, maintaining the deadly tail. Desperate, the narrator took his foot off the gas, intending to rapidly decelerate and force the truck to overtake him. The moment his speed dropped, the massive grille of the pickup truck slammed violently into the rear of his sedan. The impact threw the narrator forward against the seatbelt. The tires shrieked as the back end of the car fishtailed. He gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, fighting the physics of the crash, desperately keeping the sedan from spinning out into the dark fields. This wasn't road rage. This was attempted murder. The truck dropped back slightly, the engine revving. He was lining up for a second. Much harder ram. Ahead at this speed would send the sedan tumbling into the ditch. Survival instinct hijacked the narrator's brain. It was a split-second, do-or-die maneuver. As the truck surged forward for the kill, the narrator violently jerked the steering wheel to the left and slammed both feet onto the brake pedal. The sedan locked up, skidding violently into the passing lane. The pickup truck, carrying too much momentum and unprepared for the sudden brake check, shot past him like a missile. The narrator watched in stunned horror as the truck's brake lights flared. The driver lost control. The heavy vehicle swerved violently left, then violently right, overcorrecting before the tires lost all traction. The truck spun out, tearing across the asphalt, crashing through the gravel shoulder, and launching off the highway deep into the dark, overgrown field. The narrator didn't stop. He didn't check on the driver. He straightened out his damaged sedan and floored it, driving like a bat out of hell until he pulled into his own driveway. He locked every door in his house and dialed 911. His hands shaking so violently, he could barely hold the phone. He gave his statement, detailing the bizarre encounter in the store and the deadly pursuit on the highway. The quick-check cameras likely captured the man's license plate. But as of now, the narrator hasn't heard back from the police. His car is damaged, but his life is intact. He doesn't know why he was targeted. Was it a drug-induced paranoia? Was it a random act of absolute madness? He will likely never know. But he knows one thing for certain: the next time he needs a late-night snack, he is staying home. Story 2. The Route 82 Ambushed. For our next story, we travel to the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the American Southwest. In the summer of 2022, the narrator, a 25-year-old man, was working a grueling logistics job. He was a last-mile driver, hauling high-end refurbished electronics and custom piece components across the erratic, desolate routes of New Mexico. The company was pushing into rural markets that the major carriers ignored, which meant his shifts often stretched into 12-hour, nocturnal marathons. He didn't mind the isolation. The pay was good, and he enjoyed the solitude of the open road. But he was also a pragmatist. Delivering valuable cargo into the absolute middle of nowhere carries inherent risks. Unbeknownst to his corporate dispatchers, he kept a Glock 43 securely holstered beneath his steering column. It was a silent insurance policy he hoped he would never have to use. It was one. Like Zaro M. He was deep into the final leg of a run from Phoenix to Lovington, navigating a notoriously isolated stretch of Route 82. The road skirted the dark edges of the Lincoln National Forest. It was narrow, entirely devoid of streetlight, and heavily isolated. You could drive for 30 minutes without seeing another pair of headlights. But if you needed to cross this specific section of the state, it was the only viable artery. The detours added hours to the trip. He was cruising through the dark, the drone of a true crime podcast filling the cab, when he rounded a sweeping curve. Up ahead, illuminated by his high beams, was a small Reed hatchback. It was parked awkwardly on the gravel shoulder, its hazard lights blinking a rhythmic, desperate orange warning into the night. As he slowed his truck, the headlights swept over a young woman standing near the driver's side door. She was holding her cell phone high above her head, waving it frantically, clearly trying to catch an non-existent cellular signal. The narrator's foot hovered over the brake. His primary instinct, honed by years of consuming the very true crime media he was listening to, screamed at him to keep driving. The desert at 1. Lake Zaroam is a prime hunting ground for traps. But empathy is a powerful counterweight. He thought of his sister. He thought of his girlfriend. If they were stranded in this desolate wasteland, he would pray someone would have the decency to stop. And, crucially, his right hand drifted down to brush the cold polymer grip of the Glock beneath the dash. He wasn't defenseless. He gently depressed the brake, pulling his delivery truck onto the shoulder a few yards ahead of the stranded car. He kept the engine running, the truck in drive, and cracked the passenger window just 2 inches. The woman immediately abandoned her. Aaron sprinted to his passenger. She yanked aggressively on the locked handle. "Please," she gasped through the cracked window. My car just died. I have 0 bars. I need a ride to the nearest gas station." Her voice was tight, jittery. The words tumbled out with a slight, unnatural slur. The narrator studied her face in the dim cabin light. She looked to be his age, but there was a frantic energy radiating from her that set his teeth on edge. She was either incredibly stressed, highly intoxicated, or under the influence of something stronger. Against his better judgment, he unlocked the door. She scrambled into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut. "Thank you. Thank you so much," she muttered, staring straight ahead through the windshield, intentionally avoiding eye contact. "Wait," the narrator asked, keeping his foot firmly on the brake. "Did the engine just cut out? Did you hit something?" "Just drive," she snapped, her voice suddenly sharp. "Please, just go." Light. The evasiveness triggered every alarm bell in his head. The empathy evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard suspicion. He was seconds away from ordering her out of the cab. Before he could speak, he glanced into his side mirror to check the clearance around her red hatchback. His blood ran cold. Stepping out from the deep shadows directly behind the hatchback was a man. He had been crouching in the darkness the entire time. The narrator whipped his head forward to look at the road ahead. Standing in the dead center of the highway, illuminated perfectly by the truck's headlights, 50 feet away, was a second man. He was holding a long, heavy object, a metal pipe or a baseball bat, gripped tightly in both hands, and he was walking methodically toward the hood of the delivery truck. It was an ambush, a textbook, coordinated trap. Survival instinct didn't whisper. It screamed. The narrator slammed his foot onto the accelerator. The heavy truck engine roared, the rear tires spitting gravel as it lunged forward, swerving violently to bypass the armed man in the road. The woman in the passenger seat shrieked. She violently twisted her body, looking back at the shrinking figures of the men, and began screaming incomprehensible curses. Light. Then, she lunged toward the floorboard. She began frantically digging through her oversized purse. The narrator knew exactly what was about to happen. His right hand dropped beneath the steering column. He drew the Glock 43 in a single, fluid motion. He didn't point it at her chest. He simply brought it up and rested the heavy, black muzzle squarely on top of the steering wheel, directly in her line of sight. "Freeze," he roared, his voice trembling with adrenaline. "Do not move your hands." The woman froze. The screaming stopped instantly. Her eyes locked onto the firearm. She slowly pulled her empty hands from the purse and placed them on her lap. The frantic energy vanished, replaced by a terrifying, hollow silence. She stared straight ahead, her face completely unreadable. For 30 agonizing minutes, the cab of the truck was a tomb. The narrator drove with one hand on the wheel, the other gripping the pistol, his eyes darting between the dark road and the silent predator sitting inches away from him. Finally, the glowing sign of a gas station broke the darkness on the outskirts of Artesia. The lot was massive, occupied by two idling semi-trucks. The narrator slammed on the brakes, throwing the truck into park near the pumps. "Get out," he ordered. The woman blinked, feigning indignation. She started to argue, mumbling an excuse, trying to stall. The narrator wasn't playing games. He kept the gun concealed below the window line, leaned violently across the center console, shoved the passenger door open, and physically grabbed her jacket. He hauled her out of the cab, throwing her onto the concrete pavement. She hit the ground hard, immediately erupting into a string of loud, theatrical screams. The commotion drew the attention of a burly trucker, who had been inspecting his rig nearby. He started jogging toward them, his face dark with anger. The narrator knew exactly how this looked. A young man physically assaulting a woman and throwing her out of a vehicle in the middle of the night. If the cops were called, he would be detained, questioned, and his unregistered firearm would become a massive legal liability. He leaned out the window, pointed at the woman on the ground, and yelled to the approaching trucker, "She is part of a carjacking ring. Do not let her near your rig." He didn't wait to see if the trucker believed him. He slammed the truck into gear and peeled out of the station, leaving the woman screaming on the asphalt. Miles down the road, at a different, empty gas station, he finally stopped to fuel up. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely swipe his credit card. He walked around to the passenger side to inspect the cab. He dug his hand into the tight crevice between the seat cushions, right where the woman had been sitting. His fingers brushed against hard plastic. He pulled it out. It was a cheap, disposable burner phone. Taped to the back of it was an extra battery, and tightly bundled next to it with a rubber band was a thick, industrial pack of heavy-duty zipped eyes. The implications hit him like a physical blow. The trap wasn't just about stealing refurbished laptops. It was about taking the truck. And whatever they had planned for the driver required restraints. He threw the phone and the zipped eyes into the gas station trash can. He never reported the incident to his dispatch, and he never called the police. Explaining the firearm on the physical altercation was a bureaucratic nightmare he couldn't afford. But as he finished his route that night, the cold reality settled over him. Empathy almost cost him his life, and the weight of the Glock beneath the steering column had never felt more justified. Story 3. The Rest Stop Phantom. For our final descent into the darkness of the American highway, we look at the places designed for temporary relief. The rest stops. Isolated islands of concrete meant to offer a brief respite for the weary traveler. But sometimes, these quiet outposts are claimed by those who do not wish to be seen. The year was 2020. The narrator, a 24-year-old man, was employed by a regional logistics company. His job was straightforward: haul urgent automotive parts between the sprawling cities of the Midwest. The runs were long, the pay was reliable, and the solitude was generally peaceful. But one bitter January night shattered that peace forever. It was midwinter. The temperature had plummeted into the single digits, making the air feel brittle and sharp. He was navigating a lonely stretch of Interstate E, heading east from Des Moines toward Davenport. By 10:30 p.m., the isolation of the highway began to take its toll. The hypnotic drone of the tires and the endless, dark horizon were pulling him into a dangerous state of highway hypnosis. His eyelids grew heavy, knowing the risks of falling asleep at the wheel. He spotted the reflective blue glow of a rest area. 1 mile sign and decided to pull off. He just needed 5 minutes to splash cold water on his face and stretch his legs. The rest stop was desolate. It consisted of a small, utilitarian brick building housing the restrooms, surrounded by a dozen parking spaces bathed in the weak, flickering light of a few sodium street lamps. The lot was entirely empty, save for a single vehicle parked at the absolute furthest edge of the asphalt, near the dark tree line. It was an older model, boxy white cargo van. There were no company logos, no side windows. The engine was off. The headlights were dead. It looked abandoned. The narrator pulled his truck into a spot directly under one of the brighter street lamps, locked his doors, and jogged into the brick building to escape the biting cold. The men's restroom was sterile and silent, smelling strongly of industrial bleach and damp mildew. An ancient wall heater rattled loudly in the corner, fighting a losing battle against the winter chill. He walked to the sink, turned on the tap, and splashed freezing water over his face. The shock jolted him awake. As he grabbed a rough paper towel and looked up into the mirror, a sound cut through the rattling of the heater. The heavy metal door of the restroom had opened. He spun around. The entryway was completely empty. He stood frozen, the damp paper towel in his hand, listening intently. There were no footsteps, no breathing, just the violent rattling of the heater. He convinced himself it was just the brutal winter wind catching the heavy door. He threw the towel in the trash and quickly exited the building. The freezing air hit his lungs, but something else made his breath catch in his throat. The white cargo van at the edge of the lot had changed. The engine was still silent, but the headlights were now blazing, twin beams of harsh white light cutting through the dark, illuminating the snowbanks. He hadn't heard the engine turn over. He hadn't heard it or shut. But someone was sitting inside that metal box, watching him. A primal, deeply ingrained sense of dread washed over him. He didn't walk. He sprinted to his truck, jammed the key into the door, threw himself into the cab, and hit the locks. He cranked the ignition, threw the truck into drive, and tore out of the parking lot, accelerating aggressively down the on-ramp back onto I-80. As his truck hit the highway, he glanced back at the rest stop. The white van's headlights abruptly shut off, plunging the vehicle back into absolute darkness. Maybe it's just a tired trucker trying to sleep, and I woke him up, the narrator rationalized, his heart still hammering. He drove for 5 minutes, his eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. The highway behind him remained a sea of black ink. Light, no headlights. Light, no pursuit. He let out a long, shaky exhale. The paranoia was fading. Light, then two tiny pinpricks of light crested the horizon behind him. They were closing the distance with terrifying speed. Within minutes, the vehicle materialized in the glow of his taillights. It was the white cargo van. The narrator was already pushing 75 miles an hour, but the van rapidly closed the gap, aggressively tailgating him, hovering mere inches from his rear bumper. The narrator gripped the wheel, his knuckles turning white. Suddenly, the van whipped violently into the passing lane, accelerating until it was running perfectly parallel to his truck. The narrator risked a glance to his left. The passenger side window of the van was rolled halfway down. The interior was pitch black, but he could make out the bulky silhouette of the driver. The man was wearing a dark baseball cap pulled low over his face. The driver began gesturing wildly with his right hand, pointing urgently toward the bed of the narrator's truck, signaling him to roll down his window and pull over. For a fraction of a second, the narrator hesitated. Did he blow a tire? Had a strap come loose? Then, the cold, hard logic hit him. Light. The bed of his delivery truck was completely, undeniably empty. There was nothing back there to come loose. The man wasn't trying to warn him. He was trying to stop him. The narrator stared straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the man, his hands gripping the wheel. The driver's demeanor shifted from urgent to aggressive. He laid on the horn, a long, blaring sound that ripped through the quiet night. The massive white van began to slowly, deliberately drift into the narrator's lane, threatening to side-swipe him into the ditch. Light. The narrator swerved right, the tires catching the rumble strip. The van suddenly surged forward, cutting violently across the nose of the truck, taking control of the lane. The narrator braced for impact, expecting the van to slam on its brakes and force a collision. Instead, the van violently swerved onto the gravel shoulder and slammed to a complete, dead stop. The narrator didn't touch his brakes. He blew past the stationary van at 80 miles an hour, the wind rocking his truck. He immediately merged into the fast lane and buried the accelerator, pushing the speedometer past 90. He checked his mirror. The van had pulled back onto the highway and was accelerating hard. For the next 20 agonizing miles, a terrifying game of cat and mouse unfolded. The van would intentionally drop back until its headlights were swallowed by the distance, lulling the narrator into a false sense of security. Then, suddenly, the twin beams would reappear, rapidly closing the gap until the van was inches from his bumper once again. They were playing with him, hunting him. The narrator knew he couldn't outrun them forever. He needed a sanctuary. He needed witnesses. A green reflective sign appeared in the distance. Truck stop. 5 miles. He didn't slow down until he hit the exit ramp. He tore into the sprawling, brightly lit parking lot of the truck stop, bypassing the dark edges and slamming his truck into park directly under a massive halogen light, right next to the diesel pumps. Several massive semi-trucks were lined up, their engines rumbling softly. Through the plate glass windows of the attached 24-hour diner, he could see the silhouettes of people. He killed the engine, but he didn't get out. He sat in the cab, his eyes locked on the entrance ramp, waiting. 2 minutes ticked by. The highway remained empty. Then, moving with a slow, predatory creep, the white cargo van rolled up the off-ramp and glided into the truck's top parking lot. The narrator didn't wait. He threw his door open, sprinted across the concrete, and burst through the doors of the diner. The bell above the door chimed loudly. The sudden noise drew the attention of the older woman working behind the counter. She took one look at the wild-eyed, hyperventilating young man and immediately knew something was horribly wrong. "A van," he gasped, pointing frantically out the window. "A white van has been chasing me for 30 miles. They tried to run me off the road." The waitress didn't hesitate. She looked down the counter and barked an order to a massive, broad-shouldered trucker wearing a thick flannel shirt and sporting a dense gray beard. The trucker didn't ask questions. He slowly stood up from his stool, his sheer size commanding the room. He motioned for the narrator to follow him. They stepped out into the freezing night air. Sitting at the absolute furthest edge of the parking lot, idling in the shadows, was the white van. Its nose was pointed directly at the narrator's truck. The trucker grunted. "Yeah, that ain't right." He instructed the narrator to stay by the diner doors. Then the massive man began a slow, deliberate march across the asphalt, heading straight for the idling van. The narrator watched, his heart pounding. The trucker stopped a few feet from the driver's side window. He didn't even have to speak. The moment the trucker squared his shoulders, the van's reverse lights flared. The engine roared. The van violently backed up, whipped its nose toward the exit, and peeled out of the parking lot, the tires screaming against the concrete as it tore back toward the dark highway. The trucker casually strolled back to the diner. He shook his head, his face grim. "Two guys in the front," the trucker rumbled, both wearing thick hoodies, pulled up tight, didn't say a damn word, just stared straight ahead with dead eyes. The narrator stayed in that brightly lit diner for over an hour, drinking burnt coffee until his hands stopped shaking, waiting until he was absolutely certain the hunters had abandoned the trail. He finished his route with his eyes glued to the rearview mirror, jumping at every pair of headlights that approached. When he finally arrived at his hotel in Davenport, he parked beneath the brightest light he could find and inspected his truck. The cargo bed was perfectly secure, but as he walked around to the back, his stomach churned. Smeared across the pristine white paint of his tailgate, right near the handle, were two distinct, filthy handprints. Someone had tried to open the back of the truck in the dark. He quit the logistics company a few months later. He still drives long distances, but the rules have changed. He fuels up during the daylight. He packs enough food to avoid stopping. And he never, under any circumstances, pulls into a dark rest area at night. Because he knows with terrifying certainty that if he had rolled his window down on that dark stretch of I-80, he would not be alive to tell the story. The open road is a symbol of freedom, but freedom means there is no one around to hear you scream. Stay in the light. Keep moving. And until next time, safe travels. Have you ever watched a friendship just fade away? Not with a spectacular argument or a bitter betrayal, but with a quiet, creeping distance. You grow up, you move away, the text messages become less frequent, the phone calls stop, and suddenly, you realize a decade has slipped right through your fingers. That is exactly what happened between me. We'll use my real name, Jeremy, and a childhood friend I am going to call Scott. Scott and I were absolutely inseparable back in middle school. What? We shared everything. But after graduation, the inevitable drift began. I threw myself into the relentless, concrete chaos of New York City to chase a career, while Scott and his family retreated in the opposite direction, moving out to a deeply secluded, high-altitude mountain town. We never had a falling out. We never exchanged harsh words. The current of life simply pulled us apart until we were nothing more than silent spectators on each other's social media feeds. So, you can imagine the sheer, disorienting surprise I felt when my phone lit up one afternoon, 2 years ago, right at the beginning of December. It was a message from Scott, completely out of nowhere. He asked me to come up and visit him for the weekend. He told me it was the absolute best time of year to make the drive, painting this idyllic picture of a rustic, rural winter wonderland, buried in fresh snow. Reading that text, a heavy wave of nostalgia washed over me. I thought about the endless noise of the city, the suffocating exhaust fumes, the grind of my daily routine, and I thought why not? Wait, why not bridge that gap? It felt like a genuinely good idea to reconnect, to share a couple of beers, and to see who my oldest friend had become. I had absolutely no idea what was waiting for me up there. The departure into the mountains was agonizingly long. If you have never driven up winding mountain roads in the dead of winter, let me tell you, it is an exercise in pure anxiety. The roads were slick with black ice, forcing me to crawl along at a fraction of the speed limit. The sheer isolation of the route began to press in on me almost immediately. There were barely any other cars out there. Just me, the hum of my heater, and endless, towering pine trees closing in on both sides of the asphalt. Because it was December, the sun abandoned the sky entirely by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. By the time my GPS indicated I was finally nearing Scott's coordinates, the world outside my windshield was enveloped in a suffocating, pitch-black darkness. Scott lived in one of those incredibly old, weathered wooden houses clinging stubbornly to the side of the mountain. It was prime real estate for skiers, assuming you actually knew how to ski, which I didn't. What struck me immediately was the extreme isolation. There were maybe 2 or 3 other houses in the general vicinity, but they were scattered so far apart that you couldn't even see the glow of your neighbor's porch light. My headlights swept across the snow-packed driveway as I pulled in, illuminating the rigid, wooden structure of the house. Almost immediately, the front door creaked open, and a figure stepped out onto the porch. It was Scott. He came down the steps to greet me, but as I stepped out of my warm car into the biting, freezing air, my stomach did a strange, involuntary flip. Something was wrong. I hadn't laid eyes on him in years, so I immediately tried to rationalize the feeling. I told myself I had simply forgotten his mannerisms, or that people naturally change as they age. But it was just that he looked a little older. It was an energy, a vibration that felt entirely off. When he spoke, his voice dragged. The cadence of his words was painfully slow, almost like a cassette tape playing at the wrong speed. He would start a sentence, stop, stare blankly out into the falling snow for 3 or 4 agonizing seconds, and then finish his thought, as if he had completely forgotten what he was talking about in the middle of his own sentence. He didn't smile much. He just picked up my overnight bag and gestured for me to follow him inside. Stepping into the house offered physical warmth, but an emotional chill. The interior was startlingly barren. There was a profound emptiness to the space that made my own footsteps sound entirely too loud. The living room held practically nothing, just an old couch, a simple wooden table, a couple of mismatched chairs, and some dusty, antique-looking decor hanging awkwardly on the walls. Scott stood in the middle of the room and explained the situation. He told me this had been his grandparents' house. They had both recently passed away, leaving the sprawling, creaky property entirely to him. He was living up here on this mountain, completely alone. He pointed to the couch and told me that was where I'd be sleeping for the weekend, mentioning it folded out into a bed. I nodded, telling him that was perfectly fine. I wasn't there for luxury anyway. But as I set my things down near the couch, my eyes were drawn across the room. Directly opposite the couch was a hallway. It was a long, narrow corridor that stretched deep into the back of the house. Scott mentioned it lead to a bathroom and to guest bedrooms that sat entirely empty. The doors to those rooms were left wide open, gaping like dark mouths. There was no light fixture turned on at the far end. From where I sat on the couch, peering into that hallway was like staring into a void. A perfect, pitch-black rectangle that seemed to swallow whatever weak light the living room offered. I am a grown man. I am not easily frightened by shadows. But as I sat there, a profound, creeping sense of unease washed over me. There was nothing overtly threatening about it. Yet my eyes kept darting back to that dark corridor. It felt heavy. That first night, Scott and I sat around trying to catch up. I tried to pull the old Scott out of him, bringing up middle school memories. Old inside jokes. Things that used to make us laugh until we couldn't breathe. But the conversation was agonizingly hollow. His demeanor was incredibly socially awkward, stiff, and completely devoid of warmth. I kept trying to give him the benefit of the doubt. I told myself that living alone, isolated in a dead silent mountain cabin for years, would probably erode anyone's social skills. But it was his eyes that bothered me the most. He barely made eye contact with me. Instead, as we sat there talking, his gaze kept drifting away from my face, sliding over my shoulder, and locking onto the entrance of that dark hallway. He did it over and over again, staring into the blackness, utterly silent, before snapping his attention back to me. When the evening finally mercifully ended, Scott retreated upstairs to his master bedroom, leaving me alone on the ground floor. I pulled out the couch, tossed my blankets over it, and got ready for bed. I'll admit it, I left a lamp on. I positioned a small light right near the entrance of the hallway. I felt ridiculous doing it, like a little kid afraid of the monster under the bed. But that corridor genuinely unsettled me. I needed a boundary of light between whatever was back there and where I was sleeping. Eventually, the exhaustion of the drive took over, and I drifted off into a restless sleep. It was exactly 2. Light. 0 in the morning when my eyes snapped open. The house was dead silent, save for the howling of the wind outside. But that wasn't what woke me. It was a sound coming from directly above my head. Thump, thump, thump. Heavy, frantic footsteps. I lay there, my heart hammering against my ribs, staring at the ceiling. It wasn't the sound of someone getting up to use the bathroom. It sounded like someone was absolutely sprinting. Fast, aggressive footsteps staring across the floorboards in the room directly above me, from one side of the room to the other. Then, dead silence. I held my breath, waiting. 5 seconds passed. Then it started again. A desperate, frantic sprint back across the ceiling. The running lasted for about 20 agonizing seconds before it just stopped. No fading out. No sound of a door opening or closing. Just an abrupt, deafening halt. I lay awake for over an hour, every muscle in my body coiled tight, waiting for the floorboards to creak again. I was deeply, profoundly creeped out. But eventually, the sheer silence lulled me back into a fractured sleep. When the sun finally rose, the second day proved to be even more bizarre than the first. If Scott was quiet the day before, he was practically a ghost on day 2. He was incredibly distracted. He barely spoke a word to me. He hardly touched his food. I would look at him, try to strike up a conversation, or ask him directly if he was feeling okay, and he would simply offer this vacant nod without uttering a single syllable. I started to get angry. I didn't understand the point of this charade. Why invite someone to drive hours into the freezing mountains for a weekend of reconnection, only to act as though their presence is an agonizing burden? But my frustration was quickly overshadowed by something far stranger. Throughout the course of the day, I kept tallying his movements. At least 5 separate times, Scott got up from his chair, walked over to that dark hallway, and disappeared down its length. Now, he had told me the bathroom was down there. So, Logically, I assumed that's where he was going. But every time he walked down there, the house was perfectly quiet. I never once heard the plumbing kick on. I never heard the sound of a toilet flushing. He would just walk into the gloom, stay down there for a few minutes, and emerge looking just as blank and exhausted as before. I didn't have the courage, or perhaps the desire, to follow him and see what he was actually doing. By nightfall, the weather outside violently deteriorated. The promised no storm finally rolled over the mountain, burying the house in aggressive, howling winds. The gusts slammed against the old wooden exterior, so hard that the very walls of the cabin vibrated. Honestly, under normal circumstances, I would have loved it. I love the aesthetic of a brutal winter storm when you are safe inside a cozy room. I retreated to the couch, pulled the blankets up to my chin, and scrolled aimlessly through my phone for an hour. Letting the sound of the wind mask the unsettling silence of the house. Exhaustion won again, and I fell asleep. Once again, my internal clock betrayed me. I woke up. I checked my phone. 2:0 a.m. The wind was still roaring outside, but beneath the howling of the storm, I heard something else. Something inside the house. SK or RK. SK, RK. SK, RK. It was a soft, methodical scraping noise, and it was coming from the first floor. From the hallway. I froze. It sounded exactly like something heavy being slowly dragged across the bare, wooden floorboards. The agonizing scrape echoed through the empty space, and then, suddenly, it stopped. I lay perfectly still, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince my rational brain that old houses settle, that would expand in the cold, that the wind was playing tricks on my ears. And then, it happened. Tap, tap. It was a sharp, distinct flick against the wall directly behind my head, just inches from my skull. It didn't sound like a house settling. It sounded exactly like a human fingernail violently flicking the drywall. My blood ran completely cold. I slowly turned my head, peering over the back of the couch, staring straight down the length of the hallway. I had forgotten to leave the lamp on. The corridor was a solid wall of impenetrable black. I couldn't see a single thing, but the absolute dread radiating from that space was paralyzing. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get up, to turn on a light, to run out the front door, into the blizzard. But fear is a strange paralyzer. I didn't want to know what was standing in the dark. I squeezed my eyes shut, rolled over to face the back of the couch, and forcefully buried my head under the blankets. Old house, I chanted in my mind. It's just an old house. Against all odds, sheer mental exhaustion pulled me under. And the next thing I knew, grayish morning light was filtering through the frozen windows. But the third night is why I am telling you this story. By the time dinner rolled around on day 3, my nerves were completely frayed. A palpable, suffocating tension had settled over the entire house. I felt entirely unwelcome, not just by Scott, but by the physical space itself. And Scott's behavior had escalated. I kept catching him staring at me. Not just glancing, but locking his eyes onto me for uncomfortably long periods of time without speaking. It wasn't an empty stare anymore. It was an analyzing gaze. He looked like he was studying me, waiting to see if I was catching on to something, checking to see if I had noticed a secret he was hiding. I seriously debated packing my bags and driving away right then and there. But I checked the weather app. The snowstorm was raging violently and wasn't predicted to break until the early hours of the morning. Driving down an icy, winding mountain road in pitch darkness during a blizzard was suicide. I was trapped. After a completely silent, agonizing dinner, Scott stood up and went upstairs to his bedroom far earlier than usual. I was left alone on the first floor once again. I sat up on the couch, staring blankly at my phone, genuinely questioning every life choice that had led me to accept this invitation. Eventually, the weight of the day forced me to lie down. I shut my eyes. I commanded my brain to sleep. And then, just like clockwork, I woke up. I didn't hear a bump. I didn't hear a scrape. My eyes simply fluttered open to the dim, shadowy living room. The time, though I didn't need to check my phone to know it, was hovering right around 0 am. I blinked, staring at the ceiling, deciding to roll over and check the time. I sent the command from my brain to my arm to push myself up. Nothing happened. I tried again, pushing harder mentally. Move your arm. My arm remained perfectly still. A cold spike of adrenaline shot straight into my heart. I tried to sit up. I tried to keep my legs. I tried to turn my neck. I was completely, utterly paralyzed. I had read about sleep paralysis. I knew the scientific terminology, the neurological glitch where your mind wakes up before your body's sleep atonia wears off. But knowing the science does absolutely nothing to prepare you for the sheer, suffocating terror of experiencing it. It literally felt like I was fully conscious, trapped inside a dead body. I couldn't even twitch my fingertips. The only thing I could control were my eyes, darting wildly around the room. I tried to scream, but my throat felt like it was packed with cement. I couldn't even feel my own lungs expanding to breathe. Panic consumed me. But then, as my eyes darted frantically toward the periphery of my vision, the panic turned into something much worse. There was movement down the hall. At first, the darkness was so thick, I tried to convince myself it was just shadows playing tricks on my terrified mind. But as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, a shape began to solidify against the blackness. A silhouette. It was Scott. He was standing at the absolute farthest end of the hallway. He wasn't walking. He wasn't doing anything. He was just standing there, facing me. The darkness swallowed his features completely. I couldn't see his eyes, his mouth, or any expression, just the rigid outline of his body. His arms hung lifelessly, dead straight down at his sides. He was standing with such unnatural stillness. It looked as though he had been rooted to that exact spot for hours, just watching me sleep. It was like watching a scene from a nightmare. The kind of raw, primal horror that makes your soul want to tear its way out of your skin. I mentally screamed at him. Scott, what? What are you doing? But not a single vibration left my vocal cords. I fought with every ounce of willpower I possessed to break the invisible chains holding my body down. I just needed to twitch a finger to break the spell, but I remained a prisoner in my own flesh. I could do nothing but stare back at the dark, faceless outline of my childhood friend. He stood there for what felt like an eternity. An entire minute ticked by in agonizing slow motion. Neither of us moved. Then, completely without warning, his silhouette shifted. He slowly, rigidly turned to his right and walked directly into the open doorway of the empty guest room at the end of the hall. He didn't make a single sound. He just stepped out of sight, melting perfectly into the darkness. The moment he disappeared, the invisible weight vanished. A violent shudder ripped through my body. My fingers twitched, my arms snapped up, and I violently gasped for air as I practically threw myself upward into a sitting position. I was drenched in a cold sweat. My chest was heaving, my heart hammering against my ribs, like a trapped bird. I sat on the edge of the couch, trembling uncontrollably, staring at the empty hallway. My rational brain was working overtime. It was a hallucination. Sleep paralysis causes hallucinations. You read about this. You saw a shadow, your brain panicked, and it created an image of Scott. But the knot twisting violently in my gut told a very different story. That wasn't a dream. I cleared my dry throat and tried to project my voice down the corridor. Scott, I whispered. Silence. Just the wind outside. Every single survival instinct I possessed was screaming at me to grab my keys and run out the front door into the blizzard. But my mind couldn't let it go. I had to know. Against every fiber of my being, I slowly stood up. The floorboards felt like ice against my bare feet. I took a step toward the hallway, then another. I forced myself to walk down that oppressive, lightless corridor. My eyes locked onto the doorway of the room he had just walked into. I reached the threshold. I placed my trembling hand on the doorframe, took a deep breath, and leaned my head inside. The room was pitch black, illuminated only by the faint, bluish glow of the snow reflecting from the window on the far side of the room. At first glance, the room appeared entirely empty. No bed, no furniture, just bare walls. But then, my eyes tracked to the far right corner, right next to the window. Someone was standing there. It was a tall, dark shape. A person. They had their back completely turned to me, their face pressed almost entirely against the glass, staring out into the raging blizzard. I couldn't tell if it was Scott. The height seemed right, but the posture was deeply unnatural, completely rigid. The sight of it, this silent, motionless figure standing in the pitch black of an empty room, staring out into the storm, was the most profoundly horrifying thing I have ever witnessed. But I didn't breathe. I slowly, meticulously backed away from the doorway. The moment I was out of the hallway, I broke into a dead sprint. I flew up the wooden stairs, taking them two at a time, tearing down the second-floor hallway until I reached Scott's master bedroom. I threw the door open. Scott was in his bed, under the covers, completely, heavily asleep. Mike, my brain short-circuited. I grabbed his shoulder and shook him violently. Scott, wait, get up. He groaned, his eyes snapping open. He looked incredibly disoriented and deeply irritated. He squinted at me in the darkness, looking like a man who genuinely had absolutely no idea why a frantic lunatic was standing over his bed screaming at him. Scott, listen to me, I stammered, my voice cracking with panic. There's someone downstairs. In the guest room. I just saw them. I begged him. I pleaded with him to get up, to believe me, to come downstairs and see. Scott slowly sat up in bed. He didn't jump at alarm. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even turn his head to look out the open bedroom door toward the stairs. He just sat there, looking at me. And as the seconds ticked by, his expression slowly morphed. The irritation faded, replaced by a chilling, deadpan calm. It was a look of deep resignation. He looked at me as if he already knew exactly what I was talking about. Like I had just pointed out a leaky faucet he had been ignoring for months. It terrified me more than the figure in the window. I stepped back, my voice dropping to a harsh, trembling whisper. Like, who is that downstairs? He looked me dead in the eyes in the dark bedroom. And he just shrugged his shoulders. That was it. That was the breaking point. The tether of our childhood friendship snapped permanently in that exact second. I didn't say another word. I turned on my heel, bolted down the stairs, and frantically grabbed my duffel bag from the living room floor. I didn't care that my clothes were scattered. I shoved everything inside. I didn't care about the snowstorm. I didn't care that it was 3:00 in the morning. I kept glancing frantically toward the black mouth of the hallway, half expecting that tall, rigid silhouette to come gliding out of the dark toward me. I genuinely just wanted to snap my fingers and teleport out of that house. I threw open the front door and plunged into the biting cold. The freezing air hitting my face felt like absolute salvation. The storm was still raging, snow whipping across the driveway. I furiously brushed off my windshield with my bare, freezing hands, practically throwing myself into the driver's seat. I slammed the door, locked it, and jammed the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I threw the car into reverse, and as I started backing down the icy driveway, away from that nightmare, I made a massive mistake. I looked up. I looked back at the house, up at the ground floor window at the far end of the hallway. The window of the empty guest room. Through the swirling snow, faintly illuminated by the ambient glow of the winter storm, I saw it. The silhouette. A tall, dark, human-shaped shadow standing perfectly still in the window frame, watching me drive away. Light. That was the absolute last time I ever saw Scott's house. I drove for hours, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, jumping at every shadow until the sun finally breached the horizon and the mountain roads leveled out. After that weekend, I tried reaching out. I sent Scott several text messages over the following days, asking for an explanation, demanding to know what was going on. He read them, but he never replied. Eventually, my anger turned into a gnawing, dreadful worry. What if he wasn't safe? What if he was in danger? I finally sent him an ultimatum. I told him that if he didn't text me back, I was calling the local police department to send an officer up the mountain for a wellness check. I told him I was genuinely worried he had been murdered or something. 30 minutes later, my phone buzzed. A single text from Scott. "I'm fine." That was it. 2 words. No explanation, no apology, nothing. I tried texting him a few more times after that, but he went completely dark. Eventually, I accepted the reality of the situation and I stopped bothering. The man I sat with in that cabin was not the Scott I knew from middle school. Something in him was broken, or missing entirely. I don't know what happened to him up on that isolated mountain. And I do not know who, or what, was standing in that empty room with him. I tell myself, it's not my problem anymore. I've washed my hands of it. But if I told you that the memory of that rigid figure standing in the darkness doesn't still terrify the absolute shit out of me, keeping me awake at 2:00 a.m. in my own safe apartment. Wait, I would be lying to your face.